Not what Chairman Ryan would have written on his own. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 3 additional minutes.
Is there objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, this bill is a compromise, and that means neither side got everything they wanted, and both of us had to give a bit. I was very disappointed we weren't able to close a single wasteful tax loophole that benefits the wealthiest Americans or biggest corporations. I'd hoped we could extend critical support for workers who are fighting to get back on the job, and I was very disappointed that Republicans refused to allow that to be part of this deal. I certainly would have liked to replace more of sequestration. I know it was difficult for many Republicans to accept any increases in the BCA caps at all. And I know many Republicans that hoped this would be an opportunity to make the kind of Medicare and Social Security benefit cuts they have advocated for in the past. But I fought hard to keep them out. Mr. President, this deal is a compromise. It doesn't tackle every one of the challenges we face as a nation, but that was never our goal. This bipartisan bill takes the first steps towards rebuilding our broken budget process and hopefully towards rebuilding our broken Congress. We have spent far too long here scrambling to fix artificial crises instead of working together to solve the big problems we all know we need to address. We have budget deficits that have improved but have not disappeared, and we have deficits in education and innovation and infrastructure that continue to widen. There is much more we need to do to create jobs and boost our economy and replace the remaining years of sequestration and tackle our long-term fiscal challenges fairly and responsibly. So, Mr. President, I'm hopeful that this deal can be just the first of many bipartisan deals, that it can rebuild some of the trust, bring Democrats and Republicans together, and demonstrate that government can work for the people we all represent. I urge my colleagues to support the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. And, Mr. President, I want to thank Chairman Ryan for his work with me over the last several months. I want to thank a number of members who've worked very closely with us, including Ranking Member Van Hollen and every member of our Budget Committee here in the Senate who worked hard to pass a budget, start a conference, and get a bipartisan deal. When we come back next year, I'm ready to go to work with Chairman Ryan or anyone else from either side of this aisle who wants to build on this bipartisan foundation to continue addressing our nation's challenges fairly and responsibly. It isn't going to be easy, but the American people are expecting nothing less. Thank you, Mr. President, and I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum required under Rule 22 be waived with respect to the cloture motion relative to H.J. Res. 59.
Is there objection? Hearing none. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59, the Bipartisan Budget Act, signed by 18 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to House Resolution 59, making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2014, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and the nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin.
I didn't think you were quite all right. You just called me out.
I just called you out.
On the Senate floor.
I thought I was called out.
Mr. Barrasso.
Probably won't be able to ask you to have that. It won't be somebody.
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Yes, sir. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons.
As you can see, the Senate focusing on the federal budget today. It's a two-year agreement, and according to The Hill, the deal crafted by House Budget Committee Chair Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray, who you just saw on the Senate floor, paves the way for Congress to craft a $1.012 trillion omnibus spending bill over Christmas. And that bill would be needed to be approved by January 16th to prevent a government shutdown. Lawmakers voting now on whether to move forward with debate on the legislation. 60 votes will be needed for that to happen, so Democrats will be looking for Republican support. We'll be watching to see where that support comes from, which senators cross the aisle. Again, 60 votes needed. If it gets approved, there'd be 30 hours of further debate on the proposal, moving closer to a vote on final passage that could happen tomorrow. Only a majority vote will be needed for final passage. Now, some of those 30 hours of debate could be yielded back, but it's expected that lawmakers will use up the time. The Senate also could work today on the defense programs bill. Also out there, a number of executive nominations to be considered. Janet Yellen to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Ben Bernanke is stepping down next month. And again, as the votes come in on this motion on the federal budget, we are keeping a vote tally for you all the way through final passage.
Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Serrano. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Beckich, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Durbin, Hagan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, King, Landrieu, Leahy, Menendez, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Schumer, Udall of Colorado, Warner, and Warren. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Crapo, Grassley, Johans, McConnell, Moran, Roberts, Sessions, and Vitter. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Merkley, Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? No. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Corker? No. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Kirk? No. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Mr. Scott? No. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 67 and the nays are 33, 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to. The chair lays before the Senate a message from the House, which the clerk shall report.
House message to accompany H.J. Res. 59.
Cloture having been invoked on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment, the motion to refer falls as it is inconsistent with cloture.
Mr. President. Are we ready yet?
The senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, am I correct? We're in post-cloture now? Time?
The senator is correct.
Mr. President, I wanted to take this time to talk about the budget agreement that was negotiated by Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan, the work that they did. But I first want to relate to my colleagues conversations I had with numerous Marylanders over this past weekend, people I didn't know who came up to me and said how pleased they were that Congress was on the verge of getting something done, something that would make a difference in our budget for the next 2 years, that Democrats and Republicans actually were able to reach a compromise, and that we were actually able to get our business done in some regular order. They were hopeful that it would not only make a difference in the budget of our nation this year and next, but it was a sign that Democrats and Republicans were prepared to work together to do the people's business, that this was truly bipartisan. It was a real compromise, something that we haven't seen enough of in this Congress. The American people understand that the Congress is controlled, the House by Republicans and the Senate by Democrats. They understand that. What they don't understand is how we have not been able to get together and compromise our differences in order to move forward on the important issues of our time. They were very encouraged by this action. So, Mr. President, I intend to support the final vote on the budget agreement, and I hope my colleagues will support this agreement. It provides the framework for appropriation bills for the next 2 years without sequestration. That's regular order. The appropriations committees can now meet and decide the policy of our country through the appropriation bills as to where we believe priorities should be on federal resources. It allows us to operate, hopefully, without a continuing resolution. A number of continuing resolutions that we have passed indicate a failure, because when we pass a continuing resolution, we don't adopt the priorities for the current time. Instead, we just freeze in prior years' priorities. We now have the opportunity to enact priorities that are important today, recognizing that some of the past spending is not necessary and there's other areas that we need now to adopt, considering the changes in our own community and considering the international changes. It allows us to operate without the fear of a government shutdown. Before I said a fear of a government shutdown because we thought that we wouldn't see a government shutdown, but as we know in October we saw a government shutdown and we saw people that were hurt. We saw our economy that was hurt as a result of that shutdown. Well, now this budget agreement gives us the opportunity to use regular order so that we can pass appropriation bills or an omnibus bill that sets current priorities. It allows that to do that without the fear of closing government, which is inefficient, costly, and harms our economy and people. And the framework that was adopted in this budget agreement allows us to protect our nation's seniors, disabled children, and the disadvantaged. The resources can be made available to deal with our most vulnerable, to allow us to move forward as a nation. And it shows that we can work together. So, Mr. President, I strongly support this budget agreement, but I do so when I want to express my disappointments. And I'm sure every member of the Senate will have disappointments, but I am concerned about what is included in this budget agreement and what's not included. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about it. I am disappointed that this is a two-year agreement, that it doesn't completely remove sequestration. I think all of us would acknowledge that sequestration is something we don't want to see in effect, because what it is mindless across-the-board cuts. It doesn't set priorities. We're responsible to set priorities. If you ran into a problem with your own home budget and your family, you lost some income, you wouldn't cut every expenditure item identical. You would make decisions. You would make sure your family had a roof over them. You would make sure they had food on the table. Maybe you postpone a weekend trip. You don't treat every expenditure the same. Sequestration treats every expenditure the same. The good news in this budget agreement, the good news, we don't worry about that for the next 2 years. The bad news, it returns after 2 years. And I know that Senator Murray's worked very hard to get rid of sequestration. I know that she's going to continue to work on that as the chair of the Budget Committee. And as I said earlier, I applaud her greatly for being able to reach an agreement with the Republicans, particularly in the House. But I would hope that we could get rid of sequestration once and for all. And unfortunately, this budget agreement does not do it. Only 2 years. I would have liked to see a long-term budget agreement. And on that, I would like to see us enact a long-term budget agreement. We talk frequently about the fact that one of the most damaging parts to our inaction is uncertainty. When businesses have to make decisions and individuals have to make decisions, the uncertainty of our federal budget causes them harm, extra costs, anxiety. We need a long-term budget agreement, the so-called grand bargain. Yes, we will get an agreement for these 2 years, but it doesn't take us beyond that. And we all understand we need a responsible budget, one that deals with the investments that are important for job growth, but also reduces the budget deficit. And I know that Chairman Murray has mentioned this frequently, but let me just repeat this. During the past few years, we have reduced the deficit by $2.8 trillion. We've done a good job in reining in the federal deficit. That's over the period of FY14 to 23, and that's before sequestration. So when you go back to Simpson-Bowles and the amount of deficit reduction we were trying to get, we're about 3/4 of the way there in reducing the deficit. Yes, we got to do more. We got to continue to reduce the deficit, but let us acknowledge that we have done a pretty good job in reining in the federal deficit, and I applaud the chair of the Budget Committee for her leadership in that regard. We also must allow for critical investment for job growth. You know, we're in a global economy today. We got to invest in modernization. We need new investments in energy in this country. We need transportation investments, not just in roads and bridges, but in the transit system. We need to invest in education. Education is the great equalizer in America. We're in a global competition. We know that we are behind in the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, and math. We've passed legislation to try to catch up. We've got to fund those initiatives. The federal government's got to be an active partner in education. And I could mention many agencies, but I always like to mention the National Institutes of Health, which happens to be headquartered in my state of Maryland. And it is very important to New Jersey, the presiding officer state, and very important to every part of our country. Why? Because they do the basic research, which is the building block for the type of technology growth which is critically important in America. We got the best trained people here in America. We need to invest in the basic research so that we can continue to lead the world. And yes, the budget for NIH has not been as strong as it needs to be. We've got to invest more money in that. So the one reason, many reasons we need a long-term budget agreement, we need it for predictability, so we don't govern from one manufactured crisis to another manufactured crisis. But we also need it so that we can invest in the critical investments for job growth in America. And that's another reason why I hope that we are able to build on this two-year agreement for a longer-term budget agreement. We also need to protect the safety nets as we do that. We need a balance here. And those who are most vulnerable need to make sure that their government's on their side to help them, whether they're our seniors, whether people with disabilities, whether it's young people who need an opportunity to be able to take advantage of the opportunities in America. And we need to enhance our protection of our environment for future generations and an energy policy that makes sense, not only for America's security and environment, but also for our economy. So a balanced agreement for long-term budget, which is not in this agreement, would give us that predictability, would give us that ability to move forward. And to do that, we need to deal with mandatory spending. This budget agreement deals with discretionary spending. It doesn't deal with mandatory spending. Mr. President, we've taken steps to move in this direction. The passage of the Affordable Care Act puts in place a manner in which we can deal with health care costs by reducing the growth rate of health care expenditures, by dealing with the readmissions to hospitals, by managing complicated illnesses, duplicate tests, getting people out of the emergency room into our clinics and into preventive care, having seniors take advantage of preventive health care because they don't have to pay a copayment that they couldn't afford. These are ways that we improve what we call the delivery system of health care in America, where you bring down the cost of health care. That's the best way to bring down the mandatory spending accounts in Medicare and Medicaid, reduce health care costs. We need to do more of that. We need to get down the cost of our mandatory spending in this country, and we could have done more, and this budget agreement did not deal with that. And then there's the issue of revenue, and I'm going to talk about revenue because I was proud to be part of the Congress that balanced the federal budget when Bill Clinton was president of the United States. And you know what we did back then? We brought in more revenue and we reduced spending. And we balanced the budget, and what happened? Our economy took off. We were not only growing jobs, we were growing good-paying jobs, and the standard of living for all Americans went up. We've got to get back to that. We are spending too much today, and we don't have enough revenue. And yes, this agreement takes care of reducing some spending, but not all, and does virtually nothing about revenues. And we've got to get back to that. And we can bring in the revenue necessary to balance the federal budget by reforming our tax code. There's been some great work done. Senate Finance Committee I'm privileged to serve on. Democrats and Republicans taking a look at our code to see ways that we can make it more sense out of our tax code. We can do things about it. And let me just remind my colleagues that we spend more money in the tax code than we do through all the appropriation bills. To spend more in our tax code. Over $1 trillion a year is spent in our tax code. These are tax breaks that go to some, but not all. taxpayers. So there's no need to raise rates. All we need to do is close loopholes and be more critical of how we spend our money in the tax code, as we do on the appropriation side. Every dollar we spend on the appropriation side, scrutinized all the time. We need to do the same thing on the tax side. And quite frankly, Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch have worked out a way that the members of the Finance Committee can take a look at some of those. And I think we can reach some agreements on areas in the tax code that are not high priorities, that can reduce the revenue hemorrhaging that we have. Put another way, that if we eliminate all the tax breaks that are in the tax code, our rates could be 1/2 of what they are today. 1/2 of what they are today. So we not only can bring in the revenue necessary to balance our federal budget and allow for the type of investments that are important for job growth, we can actually reduce the rates for a large number of Americans. Unfortunately, that's not in this budget agreement. And to me, that's a disappointment, that we're not dealing with the balance that's necessary for a long-term budget agreement. And then, Mr. President, there's one other area I want to talk about, and it's not going to be a surprise to my colleagues. There's a couple other areas I want to talk about, and that's the federal workforce. This agreement provides for a 1.3% increase in retirement contributions for new hires under federal service. That's on top of an increase that was just done 2 years ago on the extension, or a year ago on the extension of the payroll tax, where we increased the retirement contributions for new hires. We also, in this budget agreement, have a reduction in the COLA increases for military retirees. I think that's regrettable. I don't believe that should have been in this budget agreement. Our civilian workforce has already contributed. When you add up what will be done by retirement contributions, that's going to be over $20 billion. But we've had 3 years of a pay freeze, and we have a way in our law where we make adjustments to our civilian workforce pay each year that reflects not the cost of living, something less than the cost of living. Our federal workforce has seen a freeze. They haven't gotten that for the last 3 years. That's close to a $100 billion contribution to the deficit. They've already done that. So they've contributed already over about $120 billion plus, and that does not include the fact that many of our federal workforce have had to go endure furloughs as a result of sequestration and government shutdowns. So our federal workforce has contributed. And this is a predominantly middle class of families. Large number of veterans, large number of women, large number of minorities. And they have contributed more than any other group of working Americans already to dealing with this deficit reduction. And I find it very regrettable that this retirement contribution provision was included in the budget agreement. Let me just quote, if I might, from the Nonprofit Partnership for Public Service, who commented to Senator Murray and Representative Ryan during the budget negotiations. And I quote for what they said, because I think it expresses my view and I hope the view of all the members of the Senate. As you work to put our federal government on a sustainable fiscal path, we encourage you in the strongest possible terms to treat the federal workforce as the considerable asset that it is and ensure that it's appropriately trained, compensated, and resourced to serve the American people with excellence for the long term. The federal civilian service is smaller today on a per capita basis than at almost any time since the Kennedy administration, yet its responsibilities are greater than ever. Rather than asking how to make the federal workforce smaller or less expensive, Congress should be asking what we need the federal government to do and what it will take to ensure that we have a workforce with the necessary skills in appropriate quantities to execute those responsibilities with maximum effect at a reasonable cost. Proposals to freeze federal pay, change retirement contributions, or reduce the workforce through attrition do nothing to improve the capacity and performance of the federal government and those who serve in the civilian workforce. These proposals are easy and expedient, but they miss the opportunity to make real sustained improvements in how the federal government manages its people, end quote. I couldn't agree more with those comments. We have a smaller workforce today, asked to do more, extremely important work. These are people who are protecting our food supply. These are the great scientists who are doing the research, to give us what we need, in new technologies, in health care. These are people making sure our seniors get the services that they so richly need and deserve. These are people that are on the front line in so many different ways. And our responsibility is to make sure they have the resources to carry out their mission. And yes, we make value judgments as to what are the priorities. But to put our class of federal workers through additional cuts, to me, was wrong, and I regret that that was included in the budget agreement. I also want to mention that I was disappointed that we were not able to use this last train that will reach the finish line before we recess to extend unemployment insurance. 1.3 million workers are in danger of losing benefits come January 1st, and in 2014, as many as 4.7 million workers will not be getting the extended benefits, 83,000 of which are located in my state of Maryland. And let me point out, we still have, I know the unemployment rates are getting lower, and we're all working to make sure to get as low as we can, but they're still substantially higher than they were when we first recognized that we needed to have extended federal unemployment benefits because of the softness in our economy. And particularly those who are long-term unemployed, it's extremely difficult to find a job. If you're unemployed and you're looking for work, it's tough out there. So the right thing for us to do is to continue these benefits for people who are actively looking for work and they can't find jobs. This is an insurance program. The monies have been collected during good times so that we pay during these times. The money is there. We need to make sure those benefits are continued. And I was disappointed that it was not included in the legislation. It will help our economy grow. It will help. There's more and more economic studies that show that every dollar we make available in unemployment compensation returns much more to our economy and job growth. So this is hurting ourselves by not extending it, plus we're hurting millions of Americans who are going to be more vulnerable in trying to keep their families together during these very challenging times. So let me just conclude by saying that, as I said in the beginning, this is an important budget agreement to get approved, and I strongly support it. I applaud the leadership of Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan in bringing us to this moment. My constituents believe this is a very important step forward, showing that we can compromise and work together and get our work done. In a few days, we will bring the first session of the 113th Congress to a close and leave Washington to spend the holidays with our families and friends. I hope each one of us will use that time to reflect on the extraordinary privilege of being a member of Congress. I hope each one of us will reflect on the extraordinary challenges our nation faces. And I hope each one of us will come to the conclusion that we can do extraordinary things if we work together. The American people demand and deserve no less. With that, Mr. President, I have 9 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, I rise today to express my disappointment that the budget deal that we will soon be voting on reflects just that, a deal. Not legislation, a deal. It raises spending above the caps. Now, that's the spending limits that we put in place just 2 years ago. It raises revenue from hardworking Americans to pay for this new spending and promises to cut some spending in the future. We've seen how that story ends before. We've already read that book. We'll spend more now, we'll grow the government more now, and ultimately the spending cuts will never materialize. I have a favorite truck driver, retired truck driver in Pinedale, Wyoming, who suggested that we needed to quit putting people in the wagon and get more people pulling the wagon. And what, of course, he's referring to is the way that we're growing government. Every time we grow government, we put some more people in this wagon that the private sector has to pull. Yes, everybody in the government pays taxes, but not one person in the government pays as much taxes as they earn. So they become a part of the burden in the wagon. Yes, even senators are part of that burden in the wagon. But we're getting less and less people pulling the wagon. And they're getting a little tired of pulling the wagon. And I'm going to show some things that are happening in this budget that are making it even tougher for them to pull the wagon. So, Mr. President, this is not the right path forward. My constituents back home in Wyoming and Americans across this country deserve better. We talk about how we have reduced the deficit. Reduced the deficit. Yeah, that means that we used to be overspending $1 trillion a year, and now we're only overspending $500 billion, which is half $1 trillion. That's still overspending. And families across America know that you can't keep spending more than you take in. Is there any indication that this causes a problem? We've been experiencing some of the lowest interest rates in the history of the country, which means the federal government has been able to borrow its money for less than it ever has been before. A few months ago, I went to one of these bond sales. It was $40 billion worth of bond sales sold in 30 minutes. People in other countries had so much courage, confidence in the United States that they were willing to pay us to take their money. They put in bids of negative interest rates. They paid us to take their money, to keep it, to make sure that it was secure, and they believed that it would be secure. So they paid us a negative interest rate. Now, at that particular bond sale, the interest rate was 0.86%. To borrow $40 billion. That's what it averaged out at. Last week we did bond sales. Last week we sold $30 billion worth of bonds. I don't know how many minutes it took to do that, but it was a relatively short period of time, probably less than 30 minutes as well. Do you know what the interest rate was? 3.90%. In just a few months, it's gone from 0.86 to 3.90. Is that factored into this budget? I'll bet you it isn't. If that interest rate keeps going up, if it hits 5%, we're not going to be able to do nearly as much as we're doing right now. We got to pay our interest first. Otherwise, we have bankrupted the United States and proven it. When we talk about raising the debt ceiling, it's a minor thing compared to being able to pay the interest on the debt. And if it keeps going up significantly, we and our kids and our grandkids aren't going to be able to pay the debt. That's what I hear across Wyoming. That's what I hear across America. And so what are we trying to do? We're trying to come up with a reasonable amount of spending for the United States. This budget doesn't do it. Now, because members are going to be voting on a deal rather than a bill that had the opportunity to be improved through the committee process with feedback from other members, we won't have the opportunity to discuss the potential unintended consequences and address them before they become law. I just heard 15 minutes of that discussion from the senator from Maryland, who knows a whole bunch of things that are in this thing that he's upset with. And I, quite frankly, think he ought to be upset with. But I'm on that conference committee. And when the deal was made, we read about it in the papers just like everybody else. We didn't get any special notice that there'd been a deal made. And on conference committees, I've seen the deals be made before. I've never seen one made by so few people before. In this one, there was a Democrat from the Senate and a Republican from the House. And the two of them came up with a conclusion that this is what we should have. Well, that's not too bad, provided it goes through a normal process, which means we get to make some amendments. Now, when you make amendments, some pass, some fail. But at least you get to bring up the unintended consequences that you see in there. And that's why we have so many people in Congress, 100 here and 435 on the other side. That's why we have a whole lot of backgrounds looking at everything that happens around here from a whole lot of perspectives, so maybe we can stop the unintended consequences. But that's only if it goes through a normal process. So far, the tree is filled on this bill. What's that mean? That means no amendments allowed. Take it or leave it. No matter what you think of it, forget it. So we're going to have some unintended consequences that are going to come out of this, and they're going to become law. Now, for example, I applaud the proposal that would limit access to Social Security's death master file to prevent identity theft and individuals from fraudulently claiming government benefits and tax refunds associated with those who have passed away. That's a good idea. However, I'm concerned that certain organizations that use that same death master file for legitimate business purposes that benefit consumers may have their access restricted. If we discussed these issues in committee, we might have been able to address them, perhaps with a sensible solution, perhaps a way that would have protected the identity and still protected the benefited the consumer. The budget deal makes a permanent provision that would require states to pay a 2% administrative fee to the federal government for the collection of mineral royalties. This only affects a few states, particularly Wyoming, so negotiators in the administration see it as an easy pot of money. We saw the same situation play out last year when the federal government saw a pot of money associated with the abandoned mine lands that primarily go to Wyoming and spent it on an unrelated highway bill. When the federal government first started to withhold the mineral royalty money owed to states, I introduced legislation with Senator Barrasso and Representative Lummis and a bipartisan group of legislators from affected states to stop it. Each of those states is fully capable of collecting its own share of the mineral revenues without help from the federal government. So we shouldn't have to pay for that. We'll continue to reverse this unjust practice. And another fascinating little thing was when we did the sequester, the money that comes in from federal mineral royalties to the federal government was considered to be revenue. The money that went out, which is by law, to the states was considered to be revenue to the states that passed through the federal government, and the federal government took 5 3/10% out of it. Until, of course, we started having a lot of success at reversing both this 2% that I just talked about and the stealing of the federal mineral royalties. And suddenly the federal government said, oh, that was a mistake. You're going to get your full half of the federal mineral royalties, less, of course, the 2%. Now, another little problem. The deal raises premiums that private companies pay the federal government to guarantee their pension benefits. That's something we've always insisted on. We've always said that the companies need to pay a fee so that if they go out of business, the people that they promised a pension to will get at least 60% of what they were promised. And that's supposed to be a trust fund to be able to pay those people if the company goes out of business. We've addressed that a number of times. We've held it sacrosanct until a couple of years ago. Now, this raises the premiums. That's gentle for a new tax. A premium's a tax. If every company has to pay another $200 per employee that receives a pension, that's a tax. Now, if it goes into the trust fund, maybe it's a fee. But here's the real kicker. This money that we did doesn't go to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. So it's a tax increase. It doesn't shore up this trust fund. It will be spent on discretionary programs. And it will be spent this year. But it will be collected for 10 years. How many people out there in America get to take their next 10 years' worth of revenue and spend it this year and then not worry about it? Nobody that I know of. Employers are still in the process of implementing and paying for a tax of $9 billion increase called for in last year's highway bill. And that, again, is a 10-year tax to build highways for 2 years. When that highway bill comes up, where are we going to steal the money next time? Well, there's always the Social Security Trust Fund and a whole bunch of other trust funds out there. I can hear the yelling about that, and I will join the yelling about that if that's even considered. But if you can tap it in the private sector, undoubtedly you can tap it in the government sector as well. $9 billion increase, that was for the highway bill. Now we have another $200 per employee, so we've got another $9 billion increase that's put on the backs of the private industry, the ones pulling the wagon that I talked about. So to put it simply, over 2 years, the flat rate premium will have increased 40%, and over 3 years, the variable rate premium, which is a tax if it doesn't go into where it's supposed to, will have increased over 100%. That's a huge tax. And I guarantee you that will end some companies' willingness to continue pensions. Pensions are voluntary. And if the cost to continue them goes up, the companies will reevaluate. In fact, I can tell you that they're reevaluating right now. When you're looking at $200 per year per employee, you got to take a look at how that affects things. So pensions will change drastically because of this agreement. Now, a few of the concerns I've just raised could be addressed. If not in committee, then here on the Senate floor. But once again, the majority leader has decided that no amendments will be allowed. They won't be allowed to be offered. They won't be allowed to be voted on. I filed 2 amendments to the budget deal that are relevant to this discussion. One with Senator Murphy regarding the need to follow congressional intent and clarify that the funding of the accounting standard setting bodies is not subject to sequestration. Now, we have a system where there are rules set up to have generally accepted accounting principles. And we have a body that's supposed to be very independent that's supposed to come up with those rules. Now, we do force the companies that are in the accounting business to pay for that body to standardize the accounting process. Now, it comes directly from the accountants, and it's supposed to go directly to this accounting board. But we've decided that sequestration should take a little chunk out of that. That should not happen. That's stealing money again. So that's one of the amendments. Another one is to strike the language making it permanent for the federal government to withhold 2% of mineral royalty owed to the states for administrative expenses. We should have the opportunity to discuss, debate, and vote on them here on the Senate floor. There are a lot of other ones, but those are 2 primary ones. We have got to stop deal-making. We've got to start legislating. Our constituents sent us here to legislate. They deserve better than a deal agreed to behind closed doors without input and improvements from the rest of the legislators, not even the committee to which it was assigned. Even though I'm disappointed in the process that has led to this point today, I'm even more disappointed in the product that resulted from the deal-making. This budget deal breaks the promise we made to our constituents back in 2011 as part of the Budget Control Act that we would reduce spending. It's worked. Now, it hasn't worked the way a lot of people would like for it to work because it's been across the board. But for the first time since the Korean War, it's reduced spending 2 consecutive years. We were close. After 2014, overall discretionary spending would have increased even with the sequester. Yes, we were almost at the end of the part of taking down the spending. But we couldn't find the will to prioritize spending this year under the current spending levels, and instead decided to ask Americans to send in more of their hard-earned money to Washington so the federal government could spend it the same way we always have. Promise the cuts in the end, take more money in the beginning. Well, I think my constituents in Wyoming know best how to spend their money. Of course, this penalizes them for their principled budgeting that they've been doing and makes it look like they have money. Every state could have money if they were as careful as Wyoming has been. Washington, D.C. has a spending problem. We don't have a revenue problem. This budget, we can think of all kinds of things that we'd like to spend money on, things that we think would be a good deal and probably that would buy some votes out there. That's wrong. We need to get things under control before that 3.90% interest rate goes to 5% or 10%, or it's been as high as, I think, 18% before. The budget deal increases spending and shows the one thing that some Democrats and Republicans can agree on, and that's putting off hard decisions. This plan spends more than the current law. It charges people and states for more things and uses the money to increase spending in non-related areas. Spending cuts are scheduled for outlying years, and so they're called, the so-called savings are used up right away. Yep, just shift that money from out there and put it into the current spending. That really isn't real. Nobody else gets to do it. It's only a government trick. We cannot spend our way to prosperity. We need to prioritize spending cuts. We need to find the spending cuts that will do the least harm and start there. And that goes through an appropriation process that works. We've been doing omnibus bills around here for a long time. I have constituents that start coming in January, and they want me to take a look at their program and add just a few dollars in there. And I have to tell them, you know, the last time I got to look at a line on the appropriations was about 5 years ago. We just take one whole lump of $1 trillion and vote it up or down one time. That's not doing our job. Our main job is spending the money. So we need to prioritize those cuts. I'll tell you how Wyoming did it. Wyoming was facing an 8% cut, they thought. An 8% cut. You know, we're talking about 2.3% for the federal government. If we compress it down to just a few months, we're talking 5.3%. But the true amount of that sequestration was 2.3%. Wyoming thought they were going to get hit for 8% because of mostly some of the regulations on energy that have reduced some of the energy production in Wyoming. But how did they go about doing it? The governor said to every single agency, I want to see from you how you would spend it if you have to cut 2%, if you have to cut 4%, if you have to cut 6%, if you have to cut 8%. And you know what he did when he got those 4 lists from every one of the agencies? He took a look to see if the items on 2%, 4%, 6%, and 8% were the same. And that's the way that you find out what the agency really thinks they can get rid of. That's a simple way of prioritizing the spending. Do we ever do that around here? No. We do have a process by which the president can have his agencies say what they intend to get done and then tell what they got done and how well they were doing. We never pay attention to that, so the ones that come out rated really badly on this just get to continue spending money like they always did. We need to have a prioritization process. We need to have a way that we can look at some of the details of the spending bills. This thing of putting off spending forever and ever and then coming in after the fact and saying, okay, this is how much we spent and how much we're going to spend and you get to vote yes or no is wrong. That, again, is deal-making, not legislating. And it won't rein in the out-of-control spending. Now, I've talked a little bit about the prioritization, which we have to start doing around here. When we do the sequestration, the complaints are that the agencies will always make it hurt. You know, I watched this when I was in the Wyoming legislature. If we just told them how much of a cut to make and didn't tell them specifically where to take it, they always did something that was very visual, that their constituents would notice, and their constituents would complain about, and their constituents would make us put it back into the spending. They didn't have to do that. There isn't any business, there isn't any government agency that doesn't have some waste. And that's what ought to go first. Then the duplication ought to go. And there's about $900 billion a year in duplication around here, but we don't even take a look at that. So another thing we could do is end the government shutdown legislation. That's one that tells those spending committees you need to get the leader to bring up your bill and you need to get it finished with amendments in the appropriate time. If you don't, then you have to cut another 1% off your spending every quarter until you get your work done. Then we don't have a shutdown, but we have a reduction in spending and some incentive for them to do that. We need to do tax reform. I agree with Senator Cardin on that. I think that could make a huge difference in how we're doing our revenue. I also have a penny plan. The penny plan just takes 1 cent off every dollar the federal government spends. And when I first started looking at this, the Congressional Budget Office said that would balance the budget in 7 years. We did that for 7 consecutive years, 1 cent off every year, balance it in 7 years. But newer evaluation is that with the sequestration, it balances the budget in 2 years, just 2 years. And when I talk to my constituents about that would be 3 3/10% for 2 years, comes almost 7% over 7 years. I think that we could do that, and we could do it with so little pain. People would say, please continue that another couple of years and pay down some of the debt. That's getting rid of the part of the deficit means that we're still overspending. But we got to at some point start paying down that debt so we don't have to pay the interest on the debt. And when we pay down a little bit of the debt so we don't have to pay as much interest, we ought to use that interest that we saved to pay down the debt some more. That's how you pay off things. People that have credit card problems know that that's the way that you go about it. I'd also like to see us go to biennial budgeting. You know, we supposedly spend $1 trillion in discretionary spending and military every year. $1 trillion. That's so much money that nobody can really look at it. And we don't. But if we divided those 12 spending bills up into 2 packages of 6, and we allowed them to have 2 years' worth of spending each time, they could plan ahead much better. And we do the 6 toughest bills right after an election, the year right after an election. We do the 6 easy bills just before an election. I'll bet you we could get through those. And then we could do what my constituents think that we're doing, which is looking at every single one of those expenditures and deciding whether they ought to go up or down. Allowing amendments on bills, allowing the spending bills to go through one at a time, maybe a week at a time. We could have them all done before October. Then there wouldn't be any government shutdown anyway. Well, there are a lot of ideas out there on what we could do, and I sit up nights worrying about the nation's debt and how it'll affect Wyoming's children, how it'll affect my children, how it'll affect my grandchildren. This budget conference was an opportunity to apply reasonable constraints to impossibly high future spending, but instead we got more spending and no real plan to solve the problem. Yes, we said, got some savings from out there in the future. We'll spend that right now. We'll make those cuts later. Never happens. For all these reasons, I cannot support the budget deal. I hope our next fiscal deadline dealing with the debt limit early next year will provide an opportunity for my colleagues and me to have a real conversation about the spending problems our country faces. The spending issue isn't going away. The longer we put it off, the worse it will become. That's the reality our country faces. I hope that we continue on the bill that says no budget, no pay, and actually get that done so that we have the emphasis to actually finish up a budget much earlier. And yes, there's blame enough to go around on the budget process. We're actually too late for the budget process to have an impact. It's the spending part that we're to, and we're not getting to address that with amendments, and I'm deeply disappointed that we're not legislating. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
I want to thank Senator Enzi for his leadership on the Budget Committee. He's a longtime member. He's a